The morning of April 17th, 1847, dawned with a thick London fog that clung to the windows of Isabella Munro's bedchamber like ghostly fingers. The mist seemed to hold the world in suspension, as if nature itself was holding its breath for the momentous day ahead. In the east wing of the Munro estate, servants had been bustling since before dawn, carrying heated water for the bride's bath, pressing linens, and arranging flowers that had arrived from the Richmond hothouse the previous evening. Isabella stood perfectly still before the ornate looking-glass, as her lady's maid Martha secured the final pearl buttons of her wedding gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk imported from Lyon and Belgian lace, so delicate it appeared to float around her slender figure. The journey to Richmond Ancestral Chapel took 20 minutes by carriage, the morning fog beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of the lush April countryside coming into bloom. The chapel stood on a gentle hill overlooking the family's vast estate, its grey stone walls and Gothic spires dating back to the 15th century. As Isabella's carriage approached, she caught glimpses of England's most prestigious families entering the stone church, the cream of English society gathered to witness the union of two great houses. Isabella was halfway down the aisle when she noticed her 17-year-old sister Charlotte seated in the front row, looking particularly lovely in a gown of pale blue silk that complemented her fair colouring. Her golden curls arranged fashionably beneath a hat, adorned with forget-me-nots. Charlotte caught her eye and smiled, but something in that smile, a knowing gleam perhaps, or a hint of secretive triumph, made Isabella's step falter momentarily. Before the vicar could speak the first words of the marriage service, Edward raised his hand in a gesture of interruption, announcing he must address the congregation. Isabella stood frozen, still clutching her bouquet of white roses, lilies, and myrtle, as Edward declared he could not proceed with this union, explaining that such an important decision as marriage must be based on more than mere agreements made in his infancy. The pain that stabbed through Isabella's heart was physical in its intensity, stealing her breath and blurring her vision as Edward turned toward her younger sister, proclaiming that Charlotte Munro had captured his heart with her vivacity and youth, and it was she whom he wished to make his duchess. The shock that rippled through the congregation was palpable, as ladies reached for their smelling salts and gentlemen exchanged glances of scandalized interest. With dignity she hadn't known she possessed, Isabella handed her bouquet to Martha, unfastened the pearl necklace from her throat, and held it out to Edward, saying, "I believe this belongs with your chosen duchess." She then turned to Charlotte, who at least had the grace to lower her eyes momentarily, wishing her joy of her choice before gathering her elaborate train over one arm and walking back down the aisle alone, each step measured and dignified, despite the whispers that followed her like poisonous fog. Outside, away from curious eyes, Isabella finally allowed herself to stumble, the April sunlight seeming a mockery of the darkness that had descended upon her life as Martha rushed after her with a cloak, suggesting they go to Aunt Agatha's townhouse in London rather than face her father's disappointment at home. The carriage journey from Richmond Estate to London was a blur of green countryside, gradually giving way to the sprawling metropolis. Isabella sat in numb silence, her wedding gown a cruel reminder of all she had lost. As London's buildings began to appear, the reality of her situation settled upon her shoulders like a physical weight. She was no longer a bride-to-be, no longer the future Duchess of Richmond. She was now something far worse in Victorian society, a woman rejected, an object of pity and gossip. By the time the carriage rolled onto the cobblestones of Grosvenor Square, Isabella had composed her exterior, though her heart still thundered with pain and humiliation. Aunt Agatha's London townhouse stood as a dignified testament to refined independence, its white Portland stone facade and black wrought-iron railings setting it apart from its neighbours. Unlike most women of her station, Lady Agatha Harcourt had never married, choosing instead to live by her own means after inheriting a substantial fortune from her father. At 62, she had long since ceased to care about society's whispers regarding her unmarried state. The carriage door opened, and Isabella found herself face to face with Aunt Agatha herself, who had apparently been watching from her drawing-room window. Tall and angular, with silver hair arranged in an unfashionably simple style, Lady Agatha Harcourt cut an imposing figure on her doorstep. Her sharp eyes took in Isabella's wedding attire, the carriage devoid of wedding guests, and her niece's devastated expression. With the quick intelligence that had allowed her to navigate society on her own terms for decades, she pieced together the situation immediately, declaring it absolutely disgraceful while helping Isabella from the carriage. In the privacy of Aunt Agatha's sitting room, with its comfortable furnishings and walls lined with books rather than the fashionable silk wallpaper found in most Mayfair homes, Isabella finally allowed her rigid posture to crumble, removing her veil with trembling hands and whispering that all of London would know by evening that Edward Richmond rejected her at the altar for Charlotte. "How can it pass, Aunt?" she asked when she was ruined. Aunt Agatha scoffed, removing her spectacles to polish them vigorously, insisting ruined was hardly the word, that Isabella was merely freed from a most unfortunate match. When Isabella expressed disbelief, her aunt asked if she had truly loved Edward Richmond, not the idea of him or the role he represented, but the man himself. The question caught Isabella off guard. She had spent so many years preparing to be Edward's Duchess that she had rarely considered the man apart from his title, admitting she had thought she did, but that she barely knew him since they were never permitted more than a few minutes of conversation. "Precisely," Aunt Agatha nodded decisively, pointing out that Isabella had been prepared to marry a stranger. A handsome stranger with an impressive title, certainly, but a stranger nonetheless, and, based on his actions, a rather contemptible one. When Isabella asked what she was to do now, having been trained for one purpose since infancy, to be the Duchess of Richmond, without that future she had nothing, Aunt Agatha firmly disagreed, insisting she had a first-rate education, a sharp mind, and the freedom to discover who Isabella Munro might be beyond the role that was assigned to her, adding that, unlike her father, she valued Isabella for more than her marriage ability, the first true flicker of possibility igniting in Isabella's grief-stricken heart. In the days that followed, Isabella retreated into the sanctuary of her aunt's vast library, row upon row of leather-bound volumes, offering escape from the reality of her situation, from the letters of sympathy that arrived daily, from her father's terse note announcing that Charlotte and Edward would marry within the month, from the gossip that undoubtedly circulated through every drawing-room in London. The library became her refuge, its oak shelves towering from floor to ceiling, filled with everything from ancient philosophy to modern novels, allowing Isabella to lose herself for hours, curled in the window seat that overlooked the small but exquisitely maintained garden behind the townhouse. One rainy afternoon, a week after what society had taken to calling the Richmond incident, Isabella was deeply engrossed in Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman when Aunt Agatha entered the library with unusual excitement, pulling open the heavy curtains to let what little daylight penetrated the London rain clouds flood the room, announcing that the Spanish Duke of Mendoza had arrived in London on diplomatic business, and that she had secured them invitations to Lady Pembroke's literary salon that evening, where he would be in attendance. Despite her reluctance, Isabella found herself dressed in a simple gown of deep blue silk that evening, its modest cut and minimal embellishment, a stark contrast to the elaborate wedding dress that now lay wrapped in tissue paper in the back of her wardrobe. Lady Pembroke's salon was held in the tastefully appointed drawing-room of her townhouse on Berkeley Square, an intimate gathering of only 20 guests assembled to discuss literature and ideas rather than gossip and marriage prospects. Still, Isabella felt the weight of curious glances as she entered the room on her aunt's arm, but kept her chin high, drawing on reserves of dignity she hadn't known she possessed. To her surprise, most guests seemed genuinely engaged in literary debate rather than in her scandal, and she found herself drawn into a conversation about Byron's Childe Harold with an elderly professor from Oxford and a middle-aged woman who had published several volumes of poetry under a male pseudonym. The discussion was stimulating, requiring enough concentration that Isabella momentarily forgot her personal troubles until a deep voice with a distinct Spanish accent interrupted, offering a different perspective on Byron's work. Isabella turned to find herself looking up into the most striking face she had ever encountered, the man who addressed her standing tall with olive skin, intelligent dark eyes, and features that appeared to have been sculpted by a Renaissance master. Lady Pembroke introduced him as Alejandro de Mendoza, Duke of Valencia, and unlike most English aristocrats who treated such gestures as perfunctory social requirements, there was a fluid grace to his bow that suggested genuine respect. When he complimented her defense of Byron's Childe Harold, Isabella felt colour rise to her cheeks, for after weeks of pitying glances and whispered conversations, to be addressed as an intellectual equal was unexpectedly refreshing. Their conversation shifted to the Duke's diplomatic mission regarding Spanish wine imports following recent changes in English tariffs, but maintained an intellectual quality that Isabella found engaging, and when she expressed surprise at his willingness to discuss trade policy with her, he explained that in Madrid, ladies frequently participated in political discussions, that his own mother had served as an unofficial advisor to the royal court on matters of international relations, and that he found the English custom of relegating women to discussions of weather and fashion rather limiting. When Isabella translated his phrase, "la tristeza dulce," as sweet sadness, his eyebrows rose in surprise, asking if she spoke Spanish, to which she admitted she spoke only a little, having focused more on French and Italian in her studies, but had always been fascinated by languages. For the first time since her wedding day, Isabella felt the ghost of a genuine smile touch her lips as the Duke replied that her Spanish was still impressive, and perhaps she might help him better understand some English idioms during his stay in London, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, intellectual stimulation gradually replacing her social anxiety, as Isabella began to see herself differently through the Duke's appreciative gaze. As the days passed, Isabella found herself thinking of her conversation with the Spanish Duke more often than she cared to admit, the memory of his respectful attention to her opinions providing a soothing counterpoint to the whispers and pitying glances she still encountered whenever she ventured beyond Aunt Agatha's sanctuary. The morning after their meeting at the literary salon, a formal note arrived requesting the pleasure of her company for a visit to the British Museum the following day, if Lady Harcourt would be so kind as to provide chaperonage. Isabella was surprised both by the invitation and by her own eagerness to accept, choosing a walking dress of forest green for the occasion, a colour she had always favoured for its subdued elegance, but rarely wore in her previous life, when pastel colours more suitable for a young lady seeking marriage had dominated her wardrobe. The Duke was waiting at the museum entrance, his tall figure commanding attention despite the simplicity of his attire, and Isabella observed a flash of admiration in his eyes as she descended from the carriage that sent an unfamiliar warmth coursing through her veins. They moved slowly through the crowded galleries, pausing to admire ancient artifacts while Aunt Agatha followed at a discreet distance, the Duke proving a knowledgeable companion, sharing insights gained from his own travels, and listening with genuine interest to her observations. When they reached the Roman Gallery, Isabella found herself describing the education she had received, which had been comprehensive by the standards set for young ladies, but always directed toward making her an ornamental duchess rather than a truly educated person, and to her surprise, Alejandro responded with neither condescension nor pity, but with thoughtful questions that treated her intellectual development as worthy of serious consideration. In Spain, he told her as they paused, before a particularly fine marble bust, we have a saying, "Val buen entendimiento más que grandes riquezas." A good understanding is worth more than great riches, though I imagine many in English society would disagree, to which Isabella replied that many in Spanish society likely would as well, prompting a wry smile from the Duke. As they continued their tour, Alejandro asked about her unusual name, and Isabella explained it had been chosen by her mother, who had harbored romantic notions about Spanish and Italian culture, opening a door for him to speak of his own background, including the loss of his parents in a boating accident when he was 14, which had left him to inherit the dukedom far too young, with only his grandfather's guidance to see him through. "May I be bold, Miss Monroe?" Alejandro asked suddenly as they paused beneath the museum's grand dome, and when Isabella granted permission, he continued, "I know of your recent situation. London talks of little else, I'm afraid, but I want you to know that I see it as the Duke of Richmond's great misfortune, not yours." Isabella stopped walking, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at the realization that he knew about her humiliation, but before she could withdraw behind her polite mask, Alejandro reached for her gloved hand, a gesture that would have been improper had Aunt Agatha not been momentarily distracted by an exotic artifact, telling her that in Spain they also believed that sometimes fate led people through darkness, only to reveal a brighter path. "Perhaps your Richmond was merely an obstacle on your true journey," he suggested, his words and the warmth of his hand through her glove sending an unfamiliar but not unwelcome sensation through Isabella, who should have withdrawn her hand according to propriety, but instead allowed herself this small defiance of convention as they stood connected by that simple touch while butterflies danced around the museum's sunlit atrium and London. Society seemed very far away. The following day, Isabella was still dwelling on the encounter at the museum when Jenkins, Aunt Agatha's butler, entered the library where she had been attempting to read, presenting a letter on a silver salver. Isabella recognized the handwriting immediately, her mother's elegant script, and with trepidation she broke the seal, discovering that the Countess of Harrington was hosting her annual grand ball the following evening, and Lady Monroe expected Isabella to attend with Aunt Agatha. More concerning still, the letter mentioned that Edward and Charlotte would be there, their first public appearance as husband and wife since their hastily arranged wedding 2 weeks prior. When Isabella insisted she could not possibly attend, Aunt Agatha firmly disagreed, declaring that if Isabella hid away, she would confirm every whisper that she was devastated beyond recovery, adding with a knowing smile that she had it on good authority the Duke of Mendoza would be in attendance, having taken the liberty of ensuring he received an invitation. The evening of the ball found Isabella standing before her mirror, examining her reflection with critical eyes, her gown a creation of deep crimson silk that Aunt Agatha had insisted upon, claiming Isabella had worn enough pastel colors to last a lifetime, a bold color that announced her transformation rather than the black of mourning or white of innocence. When they arrived at Harrington House, Isabella took a steadying breath before entering the ballroom, which glittered with hundreds of candles illuminating London's elite in their finest attire. The moment she appeared in the doorway on Aunt Agatha's arm, conversations faltered and heads turned in her direction, but Isabella held her chin high, scanning the room until her eyes found Alejandro, who stood near a column, his formal attire distinctly Spanish in cut and style. When he saw her, his face lit with a smile that somehow made the whispers around them fade into insignificance, and he crossed the room to bow before her, requesting the honor of the first waltz. Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through her consciousness, and Isabella turned to find Edward Richmond standing before her, Charlotte on his arm, her sister resplendent in a gown of pale green silk, her golden curls arranged elaborately beneath a diamond tiara, the Richmond family heirloom that should have adorned Isabella's head. Isabella felt as if all the air had been pulled from the room, yet now that the dreaded moment had arrived, she was surprised to find herself steadier than expected, responding with perfect composure, dropping into a flawless curtsy and addressing them formally as Your Grace and Duchess, adding that she trusted married life agreed with them both. Edward had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, while Charlotte merely tightened her grip on his arm, her triumphant smile barely concealed. When Edward remarked that London had been abuzz with talk of her friendship with the Spanish Duke, Isabella smoothly made introductions, noting how the two men exchanged terse bows, sizing each other up with the wariness of natural rivals, the contrast between them striking. Isabella noticed Alejandro's Spanish accent became more pronounced than usual as he congratulated them, adding that English marriage customs continued to surprise him, as in Spain, they considered a man's word his bond, especially in matters of honor. The subtle rebuke was not lost on anyone present, Edward's face flushing as he insisted that English honor was no less stringent, only that sometimes circumstances required adaptations, to which Alejandro replied with dangerous politeness that in his country they had another saying, "A man who changes his mind as often as his shirt deserves no trust, not even at Mass." As the orchestra began the opening notes of a waltz, Alejandro offered his arm, leading Isabella onto the floor and away from the couple they left behind, who no longer held power over her happiness. Whatever pain they had caused now diminished, its sting lessened by the discovery that she could face them without crumbling, that she could stand tall in her crimson gown with a man who valued her beside her, society's whispers fading into insignificance. Retry-Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The following day dawned bright and clear, as if London had decided to put aside its usual grey demeanour in honour of the decision Isabella faced. As she prepared for her walk in Hyde Park with Alejandro, she found her thoughts unusually serene. Their meeting was set for 11 o'clock, and Isabella found herself ready well before the appointed hour, dressed in a walking ensemble of deep blue that complemented her eyes, pacing the drawing room and rehearsing possible responses to what she suspected would be a formal proposal. Aunt Agatha observed with her perceptive eyes that Isabella seemed remarkably composed for a woman about to receive a proposal, to which Isabella reminded her aunt that they didn't know that was what he intended, though her heart quickened at the possibility. When Alejandro arrived, Isabella smoothed her skirts, took a deep breath, and prepared to face a future she had never imagined. They walked through Hyde Park at a leisurely pace, Aunt Agatha maintaining a discreet distance behind them, close enough for propriety, far enough for private conversation. The park was filled with fashionable Londoners taking their morning exercise, many of whom observed the trio with undisguised curiosity. When they reached a secluded bend in the path overlooking the Serpentine, Alejandro turned to Isabella with an expression more serious than usual, informing her that his diplomatic mission would conclude at the end of the month, and he would be returning to Spain. Isabella felt a sharp pang of disappointment, asking if it would be so soon, to which he confirmed, but added that before he left, there was something he must ask her. The music of distant birds and the gentle lap of water against the lake shore seemed to still around them as Alejandro reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather case containing an exquisite ring, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds. In Spain, he explained, sapphires symbolized loyalty and truth, values he had found abundantly in Isabella. He took her hand, his expression solemn yet filled with warmth, telling her that he had not come to England seeking a bride, having expected nothing more than tedious negotiations and formal dinners, but instead had found a woman of extraordinary character, intelligent, kind, and stronger than even she knew. Alejandro acknowledged that his proposal was sudden and that Spain was not her home, that he understood his request came at a time when she was still healing from betrayal, but he also knew with a certainty he could not explain that she was the woman he wished to share his life with. He knelt before her there on the gravel path, heedless of his immaculate trousers, asking if she would do him the great honor of becoming his wife, not because of arrangements made in her childhood, but because they chose each other freely as equals. Isabella looked into the eyes of the man before her, feeling a perfect clarity in that moment, as she realized the answer had been forming in her heart since their first meeting. For Alejandro had entered her life when she believed herself defined by rejection and had instead helped her discover her own worth beyond the role she had been raised to fill. In just a few short weeks, Isabella had begun to shed the layers of conditioning that had shaped her entire existence, glimpsing with him the possibility of a life built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than duty and social expectation. "Yes," she whispered. Then more firmly, "Yes, I will marry you, Alejandro." His face transformed with joy as he rose to slip the ring onto her finger, declaring it fit perfectly, as if made for her hand alone. From behind them came the sound of applause as Aunt Agatha, abandoning all pretense of not eavesdropping, approached with a broad smile, declaring she had begun to fear she would need to drop more obvious hints. As they walked back through the park, Isabella was conscious of the curious glances directed their way, knowing by evening all of London would know that the woman rejected by one duke had captured the heart of another, more distinguished one, but for her, the true story was far more significant than any gossip could capture, for in choosing Alejandro and being chosen by him, she had taken the first step toward defining herself on her own terms. The wedding preparations proceeded with remarkable speed, guided by Aunt Agatha's efficient hand. A small ceremony at St. George's in Hanover Square was arranged for the first week of June, allowing just enough time for a proper announcement and the gathering of necessary documents, but not so long that London society would have excessive opportunity to speculate or interfere. As the wedding day approached, Isabella found herself settling into a strange new reality, her days filled with selecting a modest but elegant trousseau suitable for the Spanish climate, studying books about her future home, and practicing her Spanish with Alejandro's patient guidance. 3 days before their wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived at Lady Harcourt's townhouse. The butler announced with evident disapproval that the Duke of Richmond requested an audience with Miss Monroe, specifying that he was alone. Isabella exchanged a look with her aunt, who nodded grimly, and decided this was a conversation she needed to have alone to properly close that chapter of her life. Edward stood stiffly by the window when Isabella entered the parlour, his back to the door as he gazed out at the square. The afternoon sun illuminated his golden hair and broad shoulders, the same figure that had once dominated her dreams and expectations. He turned at the sound of the door, and she was struck by how diminished he seemed compared to her memories, still handsome, still aristocratic, but somehow less imposing than the man who had occupied her imagination for years. Edward began formally, correcting himself from Isabella to Miss Monroe, thanking her for agreeing to see him. Isabella maintained a polite distance, deliberately keeping her left hand with Alejandro's sapphire ring visible as she clasped her hands before her, asking what brought him there, as his gaze flickered to the ring before returning to her face. He offered congratulations on her engagement, noting that the Duke of Valencia was well respected in diplomatic circles, but when Isabella observed this was hardly why he had come, Edward admitted he wanted to speak privately to explain. Isabella interrupted gently that there was no need, as his actions at their wedding had been explanation enough. A flicker of the old Edward, imperious and slightly impatient, crossed his face before he challenged her, asking if she truly understood why he had made that choice. Isabella studied him, seeing for the first time the insecurity beneath his aristocratic bearing, realizing that Edward Richmond, Duke of Richmond, had never in his life had to explain himself to anyone, especially not to a woman, so the fact that he felt compelled to seek her out revealed more about his character than any explanation he might offer. With calm clarity, she told him she believed she understood, that Charlotte was younger, more vivacious, perhaps more biddable, representing a better opportunity to secure his bloodline with numerous heirs, a practical choice for a man concerned primarily with practical matters. Edward looked taken aback, observing that she had changed, which Isabella simply acknowledged was true. After an awkward pause, Edward revealed the real reason for his visit, explaining that Charlotte was not well, that the transition to duchesshood had been difficult for her, as she struggled with the responsibilities and expectations. When he noted that Isabella had been trained for that role her entire life and would have managed it flawlessly, adding that he now realized he had perhaps acted hastily, Isabella regarded him with newfound clarity, asking directly if he was suggesting he regretted his choice. When Edward did not answer, Isabella felt a surge of emotion, not the heartbreak or vindication she might once have expected, but a profound sense of closure. 3 months ago, she told him softly, "Those words would have meant everything to me, but today they mean nothing at all." She wished him and Charlotte every happiness, truly, but explained that her future lay elsewhere, suggesting as she moved toward the door that perhaps he might try seeing Charlotte as more than a young, pretty bride, as she had strengths of her own, different from Isabella's, and if he looked for them, he might find a true partner rather than merely a duchess. Edward stared at her, astonishment evident in his features as he remarked that she had become quite philosophical, to which Isabella corrected him with a small smile. Not philosophical, but simply wiser about what truly mattered in life. Closing the door behind her and feeling the last weight of her former life lift from her shoulders, as she returned to the drawing room where Alejandro waited anxiously, assuring him when he asked if all was well that all was perfect, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning of Isabella's wedding dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. Unlike the elaborate preparations for her first wedding, this morning was marked by a calm intimacy. Martha helped her into a simple gown of ivory silk, new with no associations to her previous wedding, while Aunt Agatha supervised the arrangement of orange blossoms in her hair. No veil this time, Isabella had decided, wanting nothing hidden between them. Street. George's Hanover Square was modestly filled with a select group of London's elite, Aunt Agatha's friends, a few diplomatic associates of Alejandro, and a small representation from the Monroe family. Lord and Lady Monroe sat stiffly in the front pew, their expressions a mixture of resignation and calculation. Charlotte was conspicuously absent, having pleaded a sudden illness that prevented her attendance. As the organ played, Isabella walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her steps sure and her heart steady. Unlike the first time she had traversed this path, today she moved not toward a stranger and a duty, but toward a man she had chosen, and who had chosen her. Alejandro waited at the altar, his dark eyes never leaving her face as she approached. When Lord Monroe placed her hand in his, Isabella felt not the transfer of property from one man to another, but the joining of equals embarking on a shared journey. The ceremony proceeded without interruption or hesitation. When the priest asked, "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" Lord Monroe answered with formal correctness, but Isabella knew the truth. She gave herself freely and with clear eyes. As she spoke her vows in the sunlit church, her gaze never left Alejandro's face, the face of a man who had chosen her for herself, not for duty or bloodlines or social expectations. When he slipped the gold band onto her finger to join the sapphire engagement ring, his hands were steady and warm. "With this ring I thee wed," he said in his accented English, then added softly in Spanish, "With this ring I give you my heart and my life." After the ceremony, a small reception was held at Aunt Agatha's townhouse. As Isabella moved among the guests on her husband's arm, the words still new and wonderful in her mind, she caught her father's eye across the room. Lord Monroe raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, his expression inscrutable. It was as close to a blessing as she would receive from him, and Isabella found that it was enough. "Are you happy, my dear?" Aunt Agatha asked as the reception drew to a close. "More than I ever imagined possible," Isabella replied honestly. "Then my work here is done," her aunt declared with satisfaction, "though I shall expect detailed letters from Spain and perhaps a visit when you have settled in." "You will always be welcome," Alejandro assured her, bowing over the elderly woman's hand. "Without you, I might never have found my Duchess." "Oh, you would have found her," Aunt Agatha replied with a knowing smile. "Some things are simply meant to be." 3 days later, Isabella Monroe, now Isabella de Mendoza, Duchess of Valencia, stood on the deck of the ship that would carry them to Spain. The English coastline was gradually receding behind them, growing smaller with each passing minute. Alejandro joined her at the rail, his arm secure around her waist as he asked if she had any regrets. Isabella looked up at him, this man who had recognized her worth when she had nearly forgotten it herself, and replied with perfect honesty, "None. England was my past, but you are my future." As the ship caught the wind and surged forward toward the Mediterranean, Isabella felt a profound sense of peace. The path that had seemed so fixed from her infancy had taken an unexpected turn, leading her not to the life she had been prepared for, but to the one she was meant to live. The southern Spanish sun would be different from London's gentle light. The language, customs, and expectations of her new homeland would challenge her in ways she had never anticipated. But with Alejandro by her side, Isabella faced this new chapter, not with fear, but with excitement. She had entered the world as a girl promised to a duke since birth. She left England as a woman who had chosen her own destiny, and in that choice, Isabella Monroe, now Isabella de Mendoza, Duchess of Valencia, had found not just love, but her true self. The voyage to Spain took 8 days, during which Isabella discovered she had an unexpected affinity for sea travel. While many of the passengers remained in their cabins, suffering from seasickness, she spent hours on deck, fascinated by the ever-changing face of the ocean and the vast expanse of sky above them. "You would have made a fine explorer in another life," Alejandro observed as they stood at the rail one evening, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. "Perhaps in this life I still can be," Isabella replied, finding her voice stronger and more confident with each day that carried her further from England's shores. "There is an entire country waiting for me to discover it." Alejandro smiled, pulling her closer as he began to describe their future home, the ancient stone walls of the Palacio de Mendoza overlooking the Mediterranean, the orange groves that filled the air with fragrance in spring, the staff who had served his family for generations and would welcome her as their new duchess. "My steward Rodrigo has been with us since before I was born," he told her. "His wife, Eleanor, runs the household. They have been preparing for your arrival with great enthusiasm. I believe Elena has already planned menus for the first month to introduce you to Spanish cuisine gradually." "They sound wonderful," Isabella said, touched by the thought of strangers taking such care for her comfort. "They are family," Alejandro corrected gently, "as you will be. In Spain, the bonds between noble houses and those who serve them run deeper than in England. Generations of Mendozas and generations of their people, living and working together through war and peace, prosperity and hardship. As twilight deepened around them, Alejandro painted a picture of their future with words, describing the libraries where Isabella could pursue her studies, the art collections she would now have access to, and the possibility of travel to those places she had only read about in books. Instead of seeing herself as abandoning her homeland, Isabella began to envision herself as embarking on the adventure she had always secretly yearned for, but never believed possible. With each day at sea, she shed another layer of the constrained young woman who had been molded to be the perfect English duchess, replacing it with glimpses of a more authentic self, curious, passionate, and increasingly eager to embrace the unknown. On the final day of their voyage, the Spanish coastline appeared on the horizon, a golden line beneath a brilliant blue sky. As they drew closer, Isabella could make out the port city of Valencia, its ancient walls and towers gleaming in the afternoon Sunday. "Welcome to Spain, my love," Alejandro murmured, his arm around her waist as they stood at the ship's rail. "Welcome home." The word resonated within her heart. Home, not the home she had been raised in, nor the Richmond estate she had been prepared to preside over, but a new home of her own choosing. As the ship maneuvered into the harbor, Isabella felt a surge of anticipation and joy, watching the welcoming party that awaited them on the dock: Alejandro's younger brother, Miguel, several local officials, and a contingent of servants in the Mendoza livery. The greeting was warm and effusive, with rapid Spanish that challenged Isabella's still-developing comprehension. "They are saying how beautiful you are," Alejandro translated as they rode in an open carriage through the city streets toward the Mendoza Palace, "and how fortunate I am to have found an English rose to bring to Spanish soil." Isabella smiled, taking in the sights and sounds of her new home, the narrow streets with their balconied buildings, the markets filled with produce she had never seen in England, the cathedral spires rising against the blue sky. Everything was bathed in a golden light that seemed to make colors more vivid, sounds more musical, life itself more intense than in the muted grays of London. "This is just the beginning," Alejandro told her, clasping her hand as the carriage passed through massive iron gates into a courtyard filled with fountains and orange trees, where a line of servants waited to welcome them, headed by an elderly couple, Rodrigo and Elena, the steward and housekeeper. From this moment, Isabella thought as she stepped into the sunlight of Valencia, "I am not the woman who was rejected, not the bride who was left at the altar, not even the girl who was promised to a duke from birth. I am Isabella de Mendoza, and I am finally truly free to discover who I was always meant to be." 6 months later, the Palacio de Mendoza stood resplendent against the azure Mediterranean sky, its golden stone walls catching the warm afternoon light. From the terrace garden where Isabella sat sketching, she could see fishing boats dotting the bay below, their white sails bright against the deep blue water. 6 months in Valencia had transformed her in ways she could scarcely have imagined when she left England's shores. Her skin had taken on a golden hue from the Spanish sun, her once perfect English rose complexion replaced by a healthier glow. Her Spanish, once halting and formal, now flowed naturally as she conversed with servants, local dignitaries, and the villagers who had welcomed their duke's English bride with unexpected warmth. "Working on another landscape, my love." Alejandro's voice came from behind her as he emerged from the palace, loosening his cravat in the afternoon heat. Isabella smiled up at her husband. "No, I'm writing to Aunt Agatha." He settled beside her on the stone bench, glancing at the lengthy letter filled with her neat handwriting, asking how the formidable Lady Harcourt was doing. "Thriving as always," Isabella replied with a fond smile. "She writes that she's considering visiting us next spring. Apparently London society has grown tediously predictable in my absence." Alejandro chuckled, saying he looked forward to it, and that her aunt's observations on Spanish customs would undoubtedly be entertaining. Isabella set aside her writing, turning fully toward her husband as he mentioned that her letter had also brought news of the Richmonds. Charlotte was with child, due in the summer, and had surprised everyone by taking a keen interest in the management of the Richmond estates. Aunt Agatha wrote that she was quite transformed from the flighty girl she once was. "And how does this news make you feel?" Alejandro asked gently. Isabella considered the question honestly, finally answering that she was truly happy for her sister, explaining that they were both shaped by their father's ambitions, though in different ways, and perhaps Charlotte, like her, simply needed the freedom to discover her own strengths. Alejandro reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over the sapphire ring that now shared her finger with a wedding band of Spanish gold, observing that she had a generous heart. "I have a full one," she corrected him with a smile. "It's easier to be generous when one wants for nothing." A servant approached, bowing respectfully to announce that the delegation from Madrid had arrived. As they prepared to meet their guests, Isabella reflected on how her education had finally found true purpose. In England, she had been trained to be an ornamental duchess, accomplished in arts and languages, but never in matters of substance. Here in Spain, Alejandro had encouraged her to apply her intelligence to practical matters, valuing her perspective on everything from agricultural improvements to diplomatic relations. Her language skills and cultural knowledge had proven invaluable in helping him navigate relations with English merchants and diplomats, creating a partnership that benefited not just them but the entire region. As they walked arm in arm through the sunlit corridors of the palace that was now her home, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. "Sometimes," she said softly to Alejandro as they paused before the library doors, "I think about that day at the altar when Edward chose Charlotte, and I find myself wanting to thank him." "Thank him?" Alejandro asked, surprised. Isabella nodded, her eyes filled with love as she looked at her husband. "His rejection set me free to find you, and in finding you, I found myself." Alejandro raised her hand to his lips. "Then I too must be grateful to the Duke of Richmond for his profound lack of judgment that brought the most precious treasure in the world to my shores." With the Mediterranean sun streaming through the ancient windows of their ancestral home, the Duke and Duchess of Valencia entered the library together, equals in partnership, united in purpose, and bound by a love that had been chosen freely rather than dictated by duty. And in that choice lay all the difference, Isabella reflected, as the door closed behind them on a life infinitely richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined that fateful April morning when her world had seemingly ended, only to discover it was merely beginning.